Welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Nourish Child Podcast. I'm Jill Castle, your host. Today we are talking about weight stigma. It's a sensitive topic, especially for children and their families. But I have the nation's leading expert and researcher on this topic, Dr. Rebecca Puhl, to help us understand. Dr. Puhl is professor of human development and family sciences at the University of Connecticut. She's also the deputy director of the Red Center for Food Policy and Health, where she leads research and policy efforts aimed at reducing weight-based stigma and discrimination. As a national expert on weight stigma, she has authored over 170 published research articles on topics including weight-based bullying in youth, the impact of weight stigma on health, weight stigma in healthcare and the media, and policy strategies to reduce weight-based bullying and discrimination. I'm so happy to have you on the show today. Welcome to the Nourish Child.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I always start this conversation because I'm always very curious as to what led you to this work. A lot of us have personal stories related to that or just general interests. And it kind of leads us down that rabbit hole where that interest gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I'm curious as to sort of your backstory related to this topic.
It's a great question. I didn't plan to have a career studying the topic of weight stigma. It wasn't actually an issue that I really even knew about or was aware of. So initially, I went to graduate school. I got my PhD in clinical psychology. And when I was in my training at Yale, my plan at that time was to really do research on eating disorders and prevention of eating disorders. And early on in my training, I was offered a research opportunity by my mentor, Dr. Kelly Brownell, to do some research on the topic of weight stigma. And it wasn't something that was getting very much attention at the time. There wasn't a whole lot of research on it. And I thought, sure, I'll learn more about this. And I kind of jumped into that opportunity. And it was really career changing for me. I learned through that work that this was a really common issue that was not being well studied, that it was having a harmful impact on people, but that we really needed more research on this topic. And at the same time, I was also doing my clinical training, and I was working with patients with different kinds of eating struggles and eating disorders and different body sizes. And one of the things that I was observing in my clinical training is how often the stigma was coming up as a barrier and an obstacle and an experience that they were confronting. And so it was kind of these two worlds coming together at the same time, both my clinical work and my research. And it really just felt like this is an issue that I need to be working on. And I haven't really looked back since. It certainly wasn't the plan, but it's been a very fulfilling career to work on this issue.
That's amazing. I love hearing that story because it is sometimes just the perfect storm of what you're living and doing and where your interests are and what your opportunities show up to be. I want to break weight stigma down for the audience because I know that some of the parents and listeners out there will 100% understand what this is, but I also know some will be like, what does that even mean? So can you help us understand weight stigma, particularly as it pertains to children?
Sure. So when we talk about weight stigma, we are generally referring to society's devaluation of people because of their body weight or their body size. And we live in a society that negatively judges people for having a larger body weight in particular or a larger body size. And we live in a society where there are many negative stereotypes towards people with larger bodies, viewed to be lazy or unmotivated or lacking in willpower or discipline, and to be personally to blame for their weight. And these kinds of stereotypes are pervasive, and they really set the stage for things like prejudice and unfair treatment. Now, when it comes to children and adolescents, weight stigma is most often experienced as weight-based teasing or bullying. And essentially what we see in our research is that this is one of the most prevalent forms of bullying that children experience, children and teens. So we see about half of girls and about a third of boys reporting that they've been teased or bullied about their weight. So this is a common problem. Unfortunately, it doesn't get the kind of attention that it needs despite it being so prevalent.
Yeah. So it is prevalent. And I guess my follow-up question to that would be, what does it do to a child? And I know there are probably several areas that you could probably just go, please.
Yeah. This is really damaging to youth. And it's damaging both in terms of their emotional well-being and also their physical health. So if we start with emotional well-being, when kids are made to feel shamed about their weight, or they're teased or they're bullied or victimized about their weight, this increases their psychological distress. And that can mean things like elevated levels of depressive symptoms or anxiety symptoms. It often means low self-esteem and poor body image. But it also can even mean things like turning to substance use and even having suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So there really can be considerable emotional distress from this. At the same time, we know that these experiences also can worsen physical health behaviors of youth and adolescents. So when a child is made fun of about their weight or stigmatized about their weight, this can often lead to maladaptive eating behaviors. And that can range from things like disordered eating behaviors to unhealthy weight control practices to increasing their food intake or turning to binge eating. We also see that it tends to lower levels of physical activity in kids. And one of the reasons for this is that physical activity settings are a very common setting where kids are made fun of about their weight. And so a common response to this is to avoid physical activity, to avoid sports, to not go to gym class in order to escape those experiences. And then we also see somewhat paradoxically that being stigmatized about weight in youth can actually predict increased weight gain over time. And I do think it's important to mention that because there tends to be this public perception in our society that maybe weight stigma is not such a bad thing. Maybe it will motivate people to lose weight or provide an incentive for weight loss. And we see the opposite in research. So we see that stigma and shame actually predicts weight gain and even obesity over time. So there are both these emotional and these physical health consequences, and many of these are long lasting when they begin in childhood or adolescence.
Yeah. You mentioned a lot of the weight-based teasing happens in a physical activity setting. Where are some of the other settings that children might experience weight teasing?
When we think about weight teasing from peers, this happens everywhere. So it can happen anywhere on school campus, certainly in classrooms, cafeterias, the bus ride home, but it's also very prevalent on social media in terms of cyberbullying. And I think what's so different today for kids who are being teased and bullied is that it just never gets turned off because of social media. And so having that 24/7 kind of access to disparaging comments and shame, you can start to see why this is so debilitating emotionally. But the other thing to mention is that this is not just peers on the playground. And one of the most concerning findings of our research is that family members are often one of the most common reported sources of weight stigma that children and adolescents face.
That's what drew me to you, honestly. When I was doing my research for a chapter in my book that I'm writing called Family Culture, I found your research and I wanted to dive into that because I feel like that will be super enlightening for the audience to learn more about. So family-based teasing or bias or stigma, really.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, we don't often think about parents as being sources of stigma, but when it comes to weight, this is a very socially acceptable form of stigma in our society. And it's important to understand that parents are not immune to that societal weight bias. And so family weight stigma can be expressed as teasing. It can also be expressed as critical remarks, as judgment, as pressures to lose weight. And it can come from mothers and fathers and siblings and grandparents. So, again, family members are not immune to having negative attitudes when it comes to weight. And what we know is when children are exposed to this, that it really kind of communicates a message to children that they have to be a certain weight or look a certain way in order to be accepted or valued or successful, or that treating people negatively because of their weight is acceptable. And that can be very damaging to a child. And we certainly see the consequences that I was just mentioning to you with health and emotional distress, that when these come from parents, those are particularly long-lasting consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think I saw a study of yours called "The Most Hurtful Thing." Is that a title?
Yeah, that does ring a bell of one of our studies. Yeah, we've just recently finished a large study of about 2,000 adolescents and about 2,000 parents. And we really wanted to understand, how are parents and adolescents talking about weight? And what are their motivations for having these conversations? And how does it make them feel? And how do adolescents want to feel supported? And, looking at all of these questions in more detail. And we have a lot of findings from this research. One of the things we found is that parents often have positive intentions. So I think it's important to acknowledge that most parents not only want their child to be healthy, but they want their child to have a positive body image. They want them to accept their body. At the same time, those positive intentions are also coupled with concerns about their child's health or their weight, or they get expressed in ways that can sometimes backfire in these more critical types of communication. And as a result, we see that about half of adolescents do not want to talk to their parents about their body weight at all, because it makes them feel upset and it makes them feel embarrassed.
Mm-hmm. And when you think about the parent side of it, I guess, I know because I've worked with lots of families over the years, and I know that parents are very interested and almost desperate to find ways to help their child. And they inherently know that talking about their child's weight is not something that's going to be helpful, but they don't know what else to do.
So, I think it's important to recognize that about 2/3 of parents engage in what we call weight talk, which means talking about their child's weight, talking about other people's weight, or even talking about their own weight in front of their child. And those can be positive comments or they can be negative comments. And typically what we see is it's a combination of both. Mm-hmm. But of course, it's those negative comments that weigh more, right? That have that emotional impact. And so when we think about what can parents do if they're worried about their child's weight or their weight-related health, what should they say? And one of the things that we see be more effective is to actually focus less on their words and more on their actions. Mm-hmm. So to focus on modeling the healthy behaviors that they want their child to engage in, mm-hmm. and to create opportunities to be healthy at home and to engage in health behaviors together. And certainly not to single out a certain child about what they can or can't not eat compared to other people in the family. So to really engage in those healthy family behaviors together as a family. Mm-hmm. And we also recommend shifting those conversations away from the number on the scale and more on health. So talking about why healthy behaviors are important for their child's energy and concentration and abilities, rather than making it about physical appearance or how much they weigh. So really shifting the conversation to health instead is what we recommend.
Yeah. I would imagine that coming from a parent, any kind of teasing, or even not a parent, but perhaps a sibling, which is really hard for parents to control, or from an extended family member, could be super damaging to a child.
Absolutely. And, I think there has been less research on kind of other extended family members, but the research that has been done shows exactly that it almost doesn't matter which source this is coming from, that can be harmful. Yeah. And so, I think as parents, I'm a parent as well as a researcher, and I think about these issues all the time, and thinking about, what messages can we give to our children, and how do we ourselves think about weight? I think one of the things we need to do as parents is to really think about what assumptions we make ourselves about people with larger bodies. Ask yourself, how do I feel about people with larger bodies, and where do those beliefs come from?
Mm-hmm.
And try to do what we can as parents to model respect for people of different body sizes, and to point out to your child examples of people with different body sizes who are successful and kind and ambitious and talented, or working hard, all those wonderful qualities. And then also think about how we communicate in front of our children about our own bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Women in particular, mothers in particular, often engage in fat talk, which is often understood as saying things like, "Oh, I look so fat in these jeans today," or "This outfit makes me look so fat." And to think about kind of what impact that has when that's being done in front of a child as well. So the comments that we make about ourselves can also be important as well.
Kids change a lot. Their nutrition needs, eating habits, and food preferences do too. So much so, it can be hard to keep up. The Nourished Child, a website designed for parents who want more nutrition education, helps parents like you get crystal clear on raising good eaters. We've cracked the code on nourishing the whole child, whether you're raising a baby, a teen, or a child with health concerns. Our nutrition school and parent education programs help you get the inside scoop on food and nutrients, positive food parenting, and building self-motivated, autonomous kids who are good eaters. Visit thenourishedchild.com today. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things also I wanted to explore with you was different socioeconomic status groups, different racial groups, and how this may be impacting them differently in some ways, and maybe not. I don't know what your research has found and what you might share about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So in terms of experiences of weight stigma, whether it's in the form of teasing or bullying, we see that these experiences happen across racial and ethnic groups, that there's no one's immune to these experiences. And that's an important thing to just, pause on, because it means that kids who are already stigmatized because of their race or ethnicity, or even their sexual orientation or something else, if they're also being stigmatized about their weight, then those multiple stigmatized identities can have an even worse impact on their emotional health and well-being.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the research we're doing with parents and adolescents, now that talk about weight, again, we're seeing that parents and adolescents across these groups are having these conversations, and many also feel the same way. What we have noticed, though, in our recent research is that parental weight talk seems to be a bit more frequent with Hispanic and Latinx parents compared to white and Black African American parents. And again, there are important issues to consider with cultural connotations about body weight. So for example, in some cultures, especially Hispanic cultures, body weight is sometimes used in communication as a different terms of affection or endearment, which can include what we might consider to be stigmatizing remarks. So, it's important to really look at those cultural differences and values and attributions that come with body weight in these different groups.
I know a lot of your research with youth has been done with teenagers. How is weight stigma and size teasing happening in younger children, preschool, first grade, second grade?
It's a great question. So, we often think about teasing as happening in that young teenage time period. But when it comes to weight stigma, we actually see that weight-based stereotypes are present as early as preschool age, by age 3, where by that age, these almost toddlers are already ascribing more negative characteristics to peers with higher body weight than those with lower body weight. And so we got to think about, well, where is that coming from? Well, if we look at children's television programming and movies, you quickly start to pick up, if you look for it, characters that are have larger body sizes, even if they're animal characters with larger body sizes for this age group, are often characters that are stereotyped negatively. We see this in children's literature as well. And then we also need to think about the parental messages that may be communicated at that early age too. So again, parents aren't immune to weight bias. It can come out in very subtle subtle ways that we're not even necessarily aware of, but they get picked up very early on.
So given all of this information and this knowledge and this research that you've done, where do you see things moving forward for children? Where do you see, I know you do a lot of work in policy, and I know that there's also stigma in healthcare, and we should probably dive into that a little bit, because I know there are healthcare providers that listen to this show, and I would love for them to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, so these are all great questions, and these are the bigger picture issues of what do we do about this. So you're absolutely right that weight stigma is present in the healthcare system, and it is present among healthcare providers. And again, just as parents aren't immune to weight bias, healthcare providers aren't immune to weight bias either. And unfortunately, the topic of weight bias and stigma is something that is typically absent in medical training. So it's not something that they're being educated about in medical school. There's very little continuing medical education on this issue. But there has been, I would say in the last 5 years in particular, a real increased recognition that the medical community needs to address this issue. And what I can say for any pediatric providers who might be listening is that back in 2017, we actually co-authored a policy statement put out by the American Academy of Pediatrics, specifically on how pediatric health professionals can address weight stigma and bias in children. And part of that has to do with reducing bias in clinical practice and patient care, and having supportive rather than potentially stigmatizing conversations with youth and families. So, certainly that's absolutely important. You also asked, what about other kinds of policies might be something that we could consider to address this problem. And this really brings us to school-based bullying policies. So currently, pretty much every school in the United States has to have an anti-bullying policy. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that these policies vary considerably in terms of how comprehensive they are. And so what I mean by that is most school-based policies will list characteristics or enumerate characteristics that place kids at risk for bullying, like race and ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation. But often absent on that list is body weight, even though we know it's one of the most prevalent forms of weight teasing or of teasing and bullying that kids experience. It's just often not in the language of the policies. And why that's important is that when policy language includes those things, schools tend to take it more seriously, and there's more intervention, and there's more education, and there's more student safety. And so we've done a number of studies with parents to kind of look at their level of support for policies to really strengthen anti-bullying policies to better protect kids for weight-based bullying. And we see very high levels of parental support to do that. And then I think the other question you had asked me is, well, what does a parent do when we think about, where do we go from here? And what I can tell you is that in our recent research with adolescents and parents, we asked adolescents, how do you want your parents to most support you when it comes to your body weight? And what they said is they really want their parents to avoid making critical comments or pressuring them about their weight, that they want their parents to use words and terminology that they feel comfortable with, that they want their parents to make it easier to be healthier at home, and to really encourage them when they feel down about their weight, and to listen to them and try to understand their feelings about their weight. And adolescents also said to us that they would be more willing to have these conversations with parents if they're the ones that bring it up first, or if their parents ask them for permission to have these conversations. So, as parents, I think it's really more about letting the adolescent take the lead on these conversations based on their comfort level.
Yeah, for sure. I'm curious about schools that continue to weigh and check BMI status, and how that sort of might be flying in the face of good policy to prevent weight stigma in schools.
Yeah, there's been a lot of concern about monitoring and measuring BMI in schools. And a lot of times it's done for broader population surveillance purposes. But where the concerns are also coming in is how that information is collected and how it is communicated back to children and families. And there have been some cases where it really has not been communicated in a sensitive way, and where parents and youth have been understandably upset by those remarks. And, I think you kind of get to a bigger question, which is the issue of BMI. and whether this is an appropriate indicator of children's health and well-being. And there is, I think really increasing recognition that this is not the most useful tool to be using, and that by itself, BMI cannot tell us an overall picture of a person's health. We need to understand, the child's eating behaviors and their physical activity levels and their stress and their sleeping habits and their measures of things like blood sugar levels and cholesterol. I mean, there's so many indices that go into a person's health. And on its own, BMI is an imperfect measure, and it's not giving us enough information. So this is also about, I think, moving towards a more holistic understanding and approach to children's health.
Yeah. I'm seeing a movement towards cardiorespiratory fitness as a indicator of health,
Exactly.
in the school setting even. Let's circle back to the pediatrician office and what's going on. And I don't want to single out pediatricians, because there are pediatric dietitians and therapists and all kinds of healthcare providers who might be contributing to stigma in this area. What have you learned about healthcare professionals and how that may be affecting just the overall picture of weight stigma in children?
So what we know, as I mentioned before, is that healthcare providers are not immune to weight bias. They're not immune to these negative societal assumptions that we make about weight. And because weight stigma and body weight related health often aren't getting a lot of airtime in medical school curriculum, it means that there's a real lack of training. And so the providers that I speak to often don't really know the best way to approach conversations about weight related health, or they feel hesitant to bring it up, or they don't want to in some ways insult the patient, but they're not sure of how to best approach it. And so a lot of the conversations that we have are focus on the language that we use about body weight. So for example, there are a number of studies that we've done looking at what are patient preferences, including adolescent preferences, for the words that are used to describe their weight. And what we see is that words like fat or obese and a number of other words similar to those typically are viewed to be stigmatizing or viewed to be negative, whereas more neutral terminology, just talking about body weight or weight-related health, are viewed to be much less stigmatizing. And so working with providers to think about, how do I approach these conversations? And what we typically recommend is to be really straightforward in defaulting to those neutral terms by saying to a patient, could we talk about your weight today? And people have different preferences when it comes to the words that we use to talk about weight. What words would you feel most comfortable with while we have this conversation? And really approaching the conversation in that way really gives more power back to the patient in terms of language that they feel comfortable with, and giving permission to have a conversation about this issue. So a lot of what I think needs to be happening with healthcare providers comes down to how they're communicating about weight-related health.
Yeah, I agree. I 100% agree with that. I'm curious also, as a mother, I have 4 children myself. They're grown and flown. But as somebody who's worked with children, my entire career, I was hyper aware of visits to the pediatrician, visits to the therapist, visits, just even other parents making what they thought were sort of innocuous comments about the appearance of a child of mine. It is so pervasive. It's so hard to get away from it. I'm curious, as a mother yourself, if you find that as well, like that it's not sort of fading, it's getting more intense. It's almost like the more effort we battle it, it seems like it's getting more intense. And I do think social media really does contribute to that.
Absolutely. We are in an appearance obsessed society and culture, and that has not changed. And what that means as parents is, if we think about how many messages our kids are getting via social media, via television, movies, their friends, how many messages they're getting every single day that focus on what they look like. It's really overwhelming. But as parents, if we can express just one message a day that communicates to our kids that, it is their character, their kindness, their contributions to society, their hard work that matters, not how much they weigh and not the number on the scale, then at least that's one message that can challenge a lot of this other noise. You also bring up social media, and gosh, I just think, boy, I'm lucky I wasn't a teenager when there was social media. It's such a challenging time for kids to be navigating this. And I really look at social media now as kind of both kind of evil and positive. We see a lot of fat shaming on social media, which is very damaging for girls in particular, but for girls and boys and their body esteem. We see a lot of disparaging comments about body weight and size, a lot of just evaluation going on in social media about what people look like. And all of that is really harmful. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we're starting to see kind of this increasing movement on social media that is calling out these examples of fat shaming and calling out weight stigma and really giving a voice to more body acceptance. And I think that that can be a really positive aspect if kids are seeing those messages. I think it's still, the negative is likely still outweighing the positive, but at least we're starting to see some voices challenging the shame and the stigma that is so often plaguing these social media platforms.
Yeah. And we need more of that for sure. Well, I really appreciate the work that you do. And I would love to just close out this conversation with sort of where you see sort of the next level, be it policy or be it social media reform or what you see on the horizon, what you're working towards, and then also where people can find more of your work and any resources that you love yourself as a parent on this topic to share with the audience.
Sure. Well, in terms of where I think we need to go, I'm of the belief that we really need big level changes to make a dent here. And for me, that means policy. I think it's hard to change things without broader policies telling us that it's inappropriate and unacceptable to engage in weight stigma. And so, I would definitely like to see stronger policies, not only at the school level, but at the state level when it comes to anti-bullying. So we have the same issue in state anti-bullying laws that we do in school-based policies, which is that body weight is often not on the radar at all. So we need to really strengthen those policies. In terms of work that we're kind of moving towards, one of the questions that we've asked in our recent research with parents is, what kind of information would be helpful to you to help navigate these issues? And boy, did parents want a lot of guidance and a lot of information. So they want guidance on how to improve their child's body image and body esteem and how to better support their child to make healthy behavior changes and how to focus conversations on health rather than weight and how to make their child feel more supported about their weight at home. And so I think there's a real need for resources and education and support for parents in ways that are really just absent right now. And I do think that that's an opportunity for pediatric providers to really step in and to not only be modeling supportive communication in their interactions with families, but to be helping them with some of these resources. So my hope is that we're going to be using our research to really develop evidence-based resources that we can share with parents.
Yeah, that's amazing. Where can people find your research, find your work, if they'd like to reach out?
Absolutely. I would encourage folks to look at the Rudd Center website, which is www.yukonruddcenter.org. We do have a number of free educational resources, both for pediatric providers and for parents and for youth on these topics that we've been discussing today. And so I encourage you to start there as a starting point.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. I really appreciate it. And I know it's going to benefit a lot of listeners out there.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.